Loneliness is a killer. At least, that's the way it is now. Today was a good one. I found some bottled water and canned food from a gas station. The interiors of most buildings are thick with the smell of rotten meat and death, but that's to be expected now. It's been weeks since I've seen another living being. I suppose that I enjoyed the isolation at first, but as time goes on, and with each waking day, I find myself longing for companionship. The only comforting sounds that I'm left with is a desolate, howling wind and the occasional rattle of distant debris. It's amazing who we're capable of becoming, how adaptable we really are. I being the last living testament that I am aware of. I was a banker. I wore a suit and shiny shoes to work. I shaved every morning and owned a Ford Focus. I was a husband and a father. Now, I have nothing. Everything has been torn away, and all has been taken. A name, my name, is no longer important, for there is no one to tell it to. The only distinguishable feature that I own, the one thing that sculpts me into definition, is the fact that I am. There was a time that to simply exist was to fade into the background and lack personal identification. Now, it's all that's required. As far as I know, humanity is dead. I, for some unknown reason, am either immune or avoided contraction, but immunity is the more likely source. In the end, people were gathering in large hospitals and burying themselves in personal bunkers in hopes of self-preservation. But in culmination, the Great Death, as I have come to call it, seized everything. It wasn't just people. It was animals, insects, plants. Even the water had turned foul and become too poisonous to even purify. Whatever this is, it infected all exposed water and altered it into an impalpable brownish muck that has likely killed all aquatic life. Suicide has crossed my mind many times, but I'm curious to see how long I can ride out these end days. I will see my beloved family soon enough, I imagine. I take a plastic bottle from the pack on my back and open it to give myself a large sip of water in an attempt to wash the remnants of the gas station's air from the inside of my mouth, emphasized by my nose. The smell of that place was so stiflingly putrid. I could literally taste the rotting flesh in my mouth. I had hoped the water would work, but the smell remained, lessened, but there, omnipresent. That's when I realized that it was not caused by the lingerings of my previous location, but the outside air itself. The heat of the day, combined with that of the previous days, had bloated the corpses in that Sunoco station. 2 clerks lay dead behind the counter, their bellies fat with gases created by the decomposition of internal organs. 3 more corpses were in similar states, and they were found laying in the aisles, likely the store's final customers. A month ago, I would have vomited at the smell alone, but I've noticed that I'm becoming a little desensitized to it all. But now, the smell was filling the outside air. The mass of putrefying corpses in the summer heat had begun to give off a holistic stink, one that a buzzard would be able to detect for miles, if there were any animals to feed upon all of the dead flesh. It would at least help to alleviate the foulness in the air a little. But instead, all would-be animals suffered the same fate, and only made their own contributions to the stink in the air. Dead birds littered the landscape, as they had done each day since they had plummeted from the sky. The world just seemed to stop. It seemed to just die when everything else did. Thinking of my wife and children, I began my long walk back towards what I had only just come to begin calling home. Home was now an abandoned police station. The place required nearly no post-death cleanout, as most of the officers must have been out on calls at the time, trying to assist the plethora of sick. A single dispatcher was left behind the command center desk, slumped over on the dash, with the dispatch microphone still in his hand. The guy probably gave his last breath trying to help his brothers in arms, even though I moved in long before decay had really begun to set in. The smell was still quite noticeable in the small space. So, I drug what was left of the uniformed man and placed him in one of the interrogation rooms, thus giving me complete run of the rest of the police station, corpse-free. It took about another 2 days for the smell to dissipate, though likely building to unimaginable levels in the room boasted with the two-way mirror. Rationing items that I had last scavenged, I was able to hunker down for a total of 4 days before having to venture out again for food. I figured that I would head out at sundown and avoid the heat of the day, hopefully avoiding the ever-increasing wretched odor. I soon found my plan ineffective. When I first opened the door to greet the outside world yet again, I was welcomed with a repugnant stench that invaded my nostrils, causing me to gag and regurgitate a little in my mouth before I forced myself to swallow, attempting to blockade the foul odor by pulling my shirt up over the lower portion of my face. I was instantly reminded of an event from my childhood. When I lived with my parents, I would have to walk down the dead-end road that we lived on to its end and meet the bus there for school. It was when I was about 9 years old that I first became acquainted with the smell of death. For those of you that have never had the displeasure of smelling a rotting corpse, don't expect an explanation that can give it justice, at least not the justice it deserves. Rancid meat is one thing, but when you add in bile, feces, and all other aromatic substances, and leave it in the sun for a month, it takes on a definition all its own. On a morning like any other when I was 9, I walked to the bottom of that little road to find something I had never experienced. The air had a slight tang in it. The closer I got to the main road, the stronger the smell got. I looked both ways, crossed the street, and walked over to the guardrail. I then discovered a fresh deer carcass, apparently hit by a vehicle a few days prior. I stared for a while, not fearful or disgusted, as I had been around those who had harvested venison my whole life. I then resumed my position on the other side of the road and waited for the school bus to arrive. I told a few of the other kids on the bus, but honestly, I forgot about it. At least, until each evening when I arrived home, and each morning when I would return to school. The ominous smell of rotting deer would remind me as soon as I would enter its presence. I probably should have said something to my mom or some other adult, as I now know why you're supposed to inform animal control when you kill a deer on the roadway, but at the age of 9, I didn't think to do so. I figured nature would take care of it, and nature certainly took its course. Over the period of the next few weeks, that smell got worse and worse, until I could barely even wait at the bottom of the road. And upon entering the bus itself, I discovered that the scent had been so strong, it had started clinging to my clothes. Of course, kids are relentless, and this did me no favors. That was the smell I was greeted with now, only so much more intense. I imagine that opening that police station door would be similar to placing that decaying and putrefied deer carcass in the heating vent, turning it on full blast, and sticking my head inside. The shirt covering my mouth did nearly nothing. I figured my olfactory satiety would take hold, but I continued to inhale that putrid air without respite. It was as if it was too strong for my body's natural defenses, for such homeostatic mechanisms to react. I needed food, and I knew where to get it. It was just a matter of getting there. And if I had to brave the foulest of aromas imaginable, I would do so. That's when it hit me. Riot gear. The police certainly had stashes of gear to combat riot gases and such. It was just a matter of finding the right set of keys. This was actually much easier than I thought it would be. The door for the armaments cage wasn't even locked. It was probably left as such due to pandemic panic. Face shielded from the almost toxic air, I once again left for the gas station, about a mile away. I had only walked about 50 feet and froze where I stood. I had been just walking along and didn't even realize it. The birds. All of them were gone. Not a predator or scavenger in sight. No rain or windstorms. They were all certainly dead. Despite my fear, my aching stomach rumbled. I had an empirical need to press on. Now free of the ever-presence of necrotic potpourri, I found it easier to take note of the landscape itself and how much things had changed in such a short period of time. The streets were randomly littered with abandoned vehicles, some still occupied by the remnants of whoever was in them when they had last been running. The windows on most of the buildings had all been broken out, a result of vandals and riots during the last few days of civilization as we knew it. A moderate layer of dust covered everything, from the cars in the road to the human corpses on the pavement beside them, dulling everything down into an almost monotone brown hue. The world had already turned into something almost cliché in its post-apocalyptic appearance. It wasn't much longer until the gas station was upon me. Once I stepped inside, I instantly noticed that the bodies on the floor had ruptured. The heat had gotten so intense that their bodies had become so bloated, and they had literally burst. This released their putrefied insides to the walls and floors around them. The sight of it was nearly more than I could take, but I refused to take off the mask, to vomit and expose my senses to the air beyond. So, I choked it back, closed my eyes, and composed myself. It's just a little decaying matter, right? I repeated to myself, relentlessly in my thoughts. Needless to say that when I reopened my eyes and began to search for canned goods, I was a little more selective over what I would allow myself to take. I'm sure the contents were fine, but I felt that I'd have trouble eating anything from a can that I would first have to wipe clean the stuck-on human blood and gore. Not taking any more time in that nightmarish setting than I needed to, I hurriedly finished my shopping with some more bottled water from the non-functioning cooler and stuffed it into my pack, leaving with a quickened pace. For the first time in a long time, I felt relief. Such a sensation was odd, given the setting. But at that moment, I felt that anything would be better than this place. I eagerly made my way back to my current place of residence. This little excursion had me seriously thinking of finding another place to gather resources. Braving such a hellish sight just didn't seem worth it unless absolutely necessary. I had gotten so used to being alone that the slightest out-of-place noise in my surroundings set off instantaneous alarms in my brain. I was nearly back when I heard something that set off one of these red flags. At first, I thought it could have been thunder. If the rain would bring with it the same poison as the oceans, lakes, and other bodies of water, immediate shelter would prove imperative. But upon inspection of the sky above, only a shining moon surrounded by twinkling diamonds could be seen. Then, I heard it again. This time, I knew it not to be the roll of thunder, but a distant growl. But that was impossible, or so I thought. I hadn't seen anything alive in weeks. Then, I remembered the birds. Maybe there was some scavenger lurking around. After all, I survived. Maybe something else did too. I turned my head to greet the source in the direction it had come from, with trembling in my bones. Even if something was still alive, one or two predators would not be able to consume thousands of dead animals at once. I pondered the situation, still, as my eyes landed upon a distant beast. A wolf, of all things. The creature was beautiful, almost majestic, and yet there was something awkward about it. Its fur was dirty with blood and earth. A thick foam oozed and hung low from its jaw, swinging in the gusts of wind that grazed it. And its eyes, which were indistinguishably bizarre, were focused right on me. The thing was at least 100 yards away or more, standing at the end of the side street. But I knew from its starving eyes and muscle tension that I would have to run for my life to make it to the police station and inside before it would reach me and tear me to pieces. I began my sprint as soon as it broke into stride, never taking its distant, glaring eyes from me. I ran as fast as I could. I even ditched the backpack, hoping the scent would be enough to distract the beast. But as I heard the approaching patter of padded paws on pavement close the distance between us, I knew the idea had failed as well. It was now just an all-out race to the door. Either I would make it, or I wouldn't. Simple as that. I honestly thought that I was dead, that this would finally all be over. But I guess I'm still fast enough, or it was too weakened by famine or thirst to catch me. But I had made it inside and closed the door behind me, just as the thing collided with it on the other side and let out a yelp. A few moments of silence passed before I heard a monotone growl. One that repeated itself over and over, never going far from the door. That thing was certainly determined. Then, another loud bang! This one was different from the last, and by hearing the growl behind the banging, not moving or changing in intensity, it became very clear that the banging was not coming from the canine. Something else was beating on the door. I swallowed hard, took a step forward, and went to peer through the reinforced windows. Before I had a chance to take a peek, there was another bang. This one shook me to my bones, for it didn't come from beyond the door. The banging and clawing at the door intensified, but it was the previous sound that had my heart pumping. There was no way. Slowly, I crept into the observation chamber beside the interrogation room. Inside, behind the glass, highlighted with rotten facial tissue that distorted his features, glared the police station dispatcher with an intense hunger in his jaundiced, yellow eyes.